Some stories don't fade with time. This is one of them. A summer of terror. It started on a hot August night in 1975. In a small, quiet village in South Korea, something terrible happened. An elderly couple's home went silent. The only sounds were left, the insects outside, and the faint cry of someone who had survived. No one knew it yet, but this was just the beginning. Over the next 55 days, one unknown man would travel across the country, entering homes in the dark and leaving behind only fear and death. 17 people lost their lives. Entire families were wiped out. Old grandparents, young parents, even small children. People were terrified. They locked their doors as soon as sun went down. They whispered about a shadow, someone who moved without being seen and who had no reason for what he did. South Korea had never seen anything like this. The word serial killer wasn't even part of the public conversation yet. But that was about to change. His name was Kim Dae-doo, and what he did would stay in the country's memory forever. 17 people killed in less than 2 months. A wave of fear spreading across towns, cities, and countryside. Who was this man? Why did he do it? And how did a small clue lead the police to stop one of the worst killing sprees in Korean history? Early life and psychological descent. To understand how a man becomes a killer, you have to look at the life that shaped him. Kim Dae-doo was born on November 17, 1949 in Yeongam County, a quiet rural area in South Korea's South Jeolla province. His family was poor, farmers who worked hard for little. He was the oldest of 7 children, and that came with pressure. His parents didn't have much, but they dreamed big for their son. They hoped he would succeed in school, move to the city, maybe even study overseas. He was supposed to lift them out of poverty. But Kim wasn't the child they had imagined. He struggled in school, fell behind, and eventually failed his entrance exams to any respected institution. For his family, it was devastating, and for Kim, it was the start of something darker. In a country that was beginning to modernize, where hard work and education were becoming the new road to success, Kim found himself left behind. No college, no job prospects, no future. And slowly, that failure began to rot inside him. By his late teens, Kim had already begun acting out. Fights, petty thefts, trouble with the law. At first, it looked like teenage rebellion, the kind that might pass. But Kim didn't stop. His crimes got more serious. He was eventually arrested for assault and trying to destroy evidence, and sent to prison. It's there, behind bars, that something changed. When he got out, he said he wanted a fresh start. He found a work at a factory and tried to stay out of trouble. But society wouldn't let him forget his past. Everywhere he went, people looked at him with suspicion. Employers turned him away. Neighbors avoided him. Even his own family kept their distance. He later said, "Everyone, even my family, treated me coldly after I was released from jail. I wanted to earn money, just like the others." But doors kept closing, over and over. And with rejection, something inside him hardened. The shame, the anger, the feeling that no matter what he did, the world had already decided who he was. He began to see himself as a victim, not of the law, but of the society that had turned its back on him. And slowly, that bitterness turned into something more dangerous. Hate. He stopped trying to fit in. He stopped trying to prove himself. Instead, he blamed everyone else, and he began to believe that if the world had no place for him, then the world didn't deserve his mercy. It's a cruel irony. The boy who once carried his family's dreams would soon become a name that haunted an entire country. What could have been a life of purpose turned into a storm of revenge. The murders begin, a descent into madness. August 13th, 1975, Gwangju, Jeolla Province. It began on a humid August night when Kim broke into the home of an elderly couple. At first, it may have been just another burglary, a desperate man looking for cash. But something inside him snapped. When the old man discovered him, Kim didn't run. He attacked. Violently. Fatally. The woman was left badly injured, barely clinging to life. There wasn't much money in the house. That didn't matter. Kim wasn't there just to steal. He was there to make the world feel his pain. To the locals, the killing made no sense. Who would hurt such harmless people? And for what? But to Kim, the elderly symbolized everything he despised. A society that had cast him out and forgotten him. August 19, Monkan, Muan County. Less than a week later, Kim wasn't alone. On a train, he crossed paths with another ex-convict, a man named Kim Ho-woon. Whether it was coincidence or fate, the two found common ground in their anger at the world. Kim Dae-doo likely saw in Ho-woon a reflection of himself, broken, bitter, and hungry for revenge. So he convinced him to come along. Together, they entered a small corner shop run by an elderly couple and their 7-year-old grandson. But this wasn't just theft. It was an execution. The couple and child were all killed. The money they found? Barely enough for a meal. But again, it wasn't about the money. It was about domination, proving he could take life just as easily as society had taken his dignity. Emboldened by the killings, the two men headed north to Seoul, perhaps imagining greater riches. But in the busy capital, something shifted. Kim Ho-woon lost his nerve. When it came time to commit another robbery, he refused. For Kim Dae-doo, that hesitation was weakness. Their path split. From here on, Kim would act alone, driven not by greed, but by a need to unleash the hate inside him. At first, no one connected the dots. A murder here, a tragedy there. But the pattern was forming, and that's when we need to remember what South Korea was like back then. In 1975, the country was still rebuilding from war. People lived simple lives. Many worked in factories or farms, communities were tight, and strangers stood out. Most people trusted their neighbors. They didn't lock their doors at night. Violent crime? It happened, but it was personal. A fight over land, a drunken argument, something with a reason. What Kim Dae-doo was doing, going from house to house, killing people he didn't even know, sometimes wiping out entire families. This was new. This was something South Korea had never seen, and no one was ready for it. September 7th, Jungnam District, Seoul. In the city's northeast, Kim struck again. He entered the home of a 60-year-old man, someone who lived alone, someone who couldn't fight back. Kim killed him without pause. There was nothing to gain, no reason, yet every life he took seemed to fuel his hate, seemed to make him even more detached. September 25th, near Pyeongtaek. This time it was different. This time it was horrifying. In a secluded farmhouse, a grandmother lived with her 3 grandchildren. Kim broke in during the night. What happened next is difficult to speak of, even for veteran investigators. He attacked with a meat cleaver, killing the grandmother and 2 young boys ages 5 and 7. He then attempted to assault the 11-year-old girl. When he failed, he tied a cloth over her face, bound her to a tree, and left her to suffocate. Why them? Why children? Perhaps because they were vulnerable, because hurting them made him feel like the world finally had to listen. Or maybe, and this is the most chilling part, he didn't care. To him, innocence meant nothing. September 27th, Guri. 2 days later, he was back near Seoul, another family home, a young couple and their 3-year-old son. Again, death. Again, no clear motive. 2 other relatives were wounded but survived. By now, fear was spreading fast. The media began connecting the dots. Something, someone was out there, and he was killing without pattern, without reason. September 30th, Gunpo. A young mother, her 3-year-old baby. Kim broke in, assaulted the woman, and killed them both. Later, when asked why he did do that to the baby, he said the crying annoyed him. That simple. That cold. A crying baby, not a life, not a future, just noise. That answer told investigators more than they expected. It showed just how far gone he was. Not just violent, detached, dehumanized. He didn't see people anymore. Only targets. October 2nd, Suwon, another couple, spending a quiet night at home. Kim entered, killed them both, and disappeared into the dark. By now, families in the area were sleeping with lights on, locking doors for the first time in generations, arming themselves with kitchen knives or makeshift clubs. The killer could be anyone. He could be anywhere. October 3rd, a crucial survivor. In Suwon, Kim targeted a young golf assistant. The attack was as swift and vicious as others. But this time, something went wrong. The victim survived. While not first to live through one of Kim's assaults, he became the first survivor able to clearly describe the killer's face. For investigators, it was a turning point, a living witness with a memory sharp enough to help. Kim had made a mistake, and he knew it. Finally, someone who had seen the killer's face and lived to tell it. He ran, back to Seoul, back to the crowds where he could disappear again. But even then, he wasn't done. Dobong District, the final victim. Kim tried to recruit another accomplice, another man down on his luck. But this time, his companion wasn't interested in killing. He tried to rob Kim and flee. Kim caught him and murdered, taking his bloody jeans with him. It was a mistake that would cost him everything. Manhunt and capture. Slowly, police across the country began to piece things together. Officers from different provinces started to notice chilling similarities. Families killed in their homes, isolated villages struck down in silence. young and old murdered with no mercy. And for the first time in South Korean history, law enforcement began acting like a unified front, sharing files, sketching profiles, and tightening their watch on the train stations and bus terminals. They believed that killer was on the move constantly, hiding among crowds, vanishing between regions before anyone could catch him. Still, Kim remained one step ahead. He changed locations often, struck at random, and picked victims who lived far from any police presence. In a world without CCTV, mobile phones, or DNA testing, he was almost impossible to track. But what finally brought him down wasn't brilliant detective work. It was a mistake. A small, almost careless decision that exposed the monster hiding in plain sight. After his final murder, Kim was left with blood-stained jeans. The man's lifeless body had been discarded, but the clothing remained, soaked with the evidence of his crime. Kim knew he couldn't walk around Seoul looking like that. So, in an oddly casual move, he walked into a small laundromat near Cheongyangni station. He handed the bloody jeans to the owner and asked them to be washed. Perhaps he thought no one would notice, that in a big city people are too busy to care. But 26-year-old Ha Gyun-bae wasn't just anyone. He looked at those jeans, the deep red stains, the soaked fabric, and he knew something wasn't right. When he asked about it, Kim gave a weak excuse, a nosebleed after a drunken fight. But Mr. Ha didn't believe it. There was too much blood, too many headlines flashing through his mind. Murders, families wiped out, a killer still at rampage. His instincts told him that this wasn't just a customer, it was something worse, much worse. Quietly, Ha slipped away and called the police. That phone call changed everything. Police rushed to the laundromat. Kim was still there, waiting. He didn't run, he didn't fight. Maybe he thought he'd talk his way out of it. At the station, he stuck to his story. First, it was a fight. Then, it was a gang of thugs who beat him up. But none of it held up. The blood didn't match the timeline. No one had seen this supposed fight. And as detectives pushed harder, Kim began to crack. Not with tears or rage, but with cold calculation. He confessed. Without much hesitation, he laid it all out. Every attack, every victim, every reason he had convinced himself he was justified. He even gave up his early accomplice, Kim Ho-woon, revealing that they had committed the Won County murders together. And just like that, after 55 days of fear, the nightmare was finally over. Motives of a murderer. With Kim's full confession in hand, the investigation moved quickly. Police began retracing his steps, matching each chilling detail with crime scene evidence. Items found in his bag aligned with stolen belongings. Witnesses who had survived, few as they were, confirmed parts of his story. And his former accomplice, Kim Ho-woon, was soon tracked down and arrested for his role in the early killings in Won County. These weren't quiet police visits. They were public reenactments, stage events where Kim was asked to show investigators exactly how each attack happened. It was meant to verify his confession, but it also served another purpose, to show the public that the terror was over. The crowds came in silence. Standing behind police barricades, they watched the man who had brought so much fear to their lives walk through the neighborhoods in handcuffs, pointing out windows he'd climbed through and rooms where lives were taken. There was no remorse on his face. At one reenactment, a reporter described him chewing gum, looking around casually, even letting out a laugh. Whether those accounts were exaggerated or not, one thing was clear. Kim showed almost no remorse. Instead, he seemed eager to explain himself, casting his actions as a twisted form of justice. In a press interview, Kim expressed a deep anger toward the world. He recalled how he was shunned after his release from prison. He claimed society had rejected him, so he fought back, the only way he knew how. He admitted to targeting the poor, not out of mercy, but because no one cares about the poor, making them less protected and less likely to draw attention. The total amount he stole across all his crimes? Just 26,000 won. Mere $20. Barely enough to survive. Clearly, theft was never the real goal. The real motive, Kim confessed, was rage and something else. Transformation. After his first killing, he felt something change inside him. After the first time, I wasn't afraid anymore, he said. I wanted to prove I was strong. That strength meant terrifying others the way he had once felt weak, to ensure no one could identify him. Kim admitted he often left no witnesses, even saying that he would silence anyone who might remember his face. One of the most haunting confessions came when he admitted to being irritated by a crying baby during one of his attacks. He said the sound bothered him so much that he couldn't take it. It was a chilling display of emotional detachment. These statements painted a picture not only of a man lashing out, but of someone who had crossed the line into cold, calculated cruelty. Psychologists would later suggest he displayed signs of antisocial personality disorder. No empathy, no remorse, and a dangerous mix of narcissism and aggression. But Kim didn't speak like a clinical case study. He spoke like someone who believed the world had pushed him into a darkness, and once there, he embraced it. Listening to Kim's words, you might almost feel a trace of sympathy, until you remember the victims, the children, the families, the strangers who never did any harm. Kim Dae-doo's case forces us to ask, when society turns its back on someone, and that person turns violent, where does the blame truly lie? On the world that rejected him, or the man who chose to kill? The public already decided who Kim Dae-doo was. A monster. Newspapers splashed his name across the front pages. They called him the devil. Others labeled him a murderous beast. And in homes across the country, people whispered those names with a mix of horror and relief. The man who had haunted their nights was finally behind bars. But justice, in the eyes of the public, demanded more than an arrest. There was no debate, no hesitation. Kim Dae-doo would face the harshest punishment the law allowed. Trial and judgment. Kim Dae-doo's trial began in the final weeks of 1975. It wasn't a long trial. How could it be? He had confessed in chilling detail. The evidence, the survivor testimony, the crime scene forensics, all of it pointed in one direction. Still, the courtroom was packed. Journalists filled every seat. Grieving families sat in silence, hoping to look the man in the eye who had shattered their lives. Kim sat pale and thin in the defendant's chair, shackled and expressionless. He said little. He apologized to no one. Alongside him stood Kim Ho-woon, his early accomplice. While Kim Dae-doo faced charges for 17 killings, Ho-woon was charged for only one incident. He claimed he acted under pressure. It didn't matter. The court found them both guilty of murder, robbery, and sexual assault. The verdict came swiftly. In November 1975, Kim Dae-doo was sentenced to death. There were no protests, no pleas for mercy. The decision echoed what many in South Korea were already saying. This man had crossed the line from which there was no return. His accomplice, Kim Ho-woon, also received a death sentence, but that wouldn't last. On appeal, the court reviewed his limited role. He hadn't participated in the full spree. He hadn't continued on after their brief partnership ended. Eventually, his sentence was reduced to life in prison. The justice system, it seemed, had drawn a clear line between evil and someone who was swept up in it. For the families of the victims, the sentence offered a shard of peace, yet it didn't bring anyone back. But it sent a message that the pain inflicted on them would not be ignored. And yet, not everyone felt closure. One of Kim's own defense attorneys, Lee Sang-hyuk, made a final plea before sentencing. He didn't argue that Kim should go free. Far from it, but he urged the court to study his case deeply. "We must understand how a person like this is made," he said. "Only by understanding can we hope to prevent it from happening again." But the country wasn't ready to ask those questions. Not then. The government was hardline. The media was relentless. The public was still terrified. What people wanted now was justice, not psychology. So Kim was sent to death row, where he waited for the day it would all end. And something began to change. For the first time, Kim wasn't lashing out. He wasn't smirking or chewing gum or trying to justify himself. He became quiet, withdrawn. He began attending church services inside the prison. He converted to Christianity. Those who saw him said he often cried during prayer. Not loudly, not for attention, but like a man who would no longer run from what he'd done. Was it real remorse? Was it fear? Maybe both. Even the guards noticed. Kim, once cold and detached, now sat in silence, as if haunted by every face he had tried to forget. Maybe the mask had finally cracked. Maybe, facing death, he could no longer hide from the ghosts he had created. In the end, the monster South Korea feared most became a man waiting for the end. Not with pride, but with something closer to sorrow. Whether it was redemption or just regret, no one can say. But his final days were not spent in violence. They were spent in deep silence. Sentence carried out and final words. At dawn on September 28, 1976, a little over a year after his arrest, Kim Dae-doo was hanged inside Seo Diamond Prison in Seoul. He was 27 years old. Such sentences in South Korea at the time were carried out quietly, behind closed doors. There were no televised reports, no public announcements until after the fact. But one detail has been confirmed. Kim spent his final night in prayer, speaking with the prison pastor until the early hours of the morning. And no family members came to visit. None came to claim his body. It seemed even those closest to him wanted nothing to do with the name that had come to symbolize terror. Outside the prison walls, there were no protests, no mourning. For most of the country, Kim's death marked the end of a nightmare. Justice served and a dark chapter finally closed. But just before his execution, Kim Dae-doo made one last move no one expected. He left behind a handwritten final statement. not a plea for forgiveness and not an attempt to clear his name. Instead, it read more like a warning, a message from someone who had walked the darkest path, and now, with no future left, wanted others to understand how that path began. Kim's first point was directed at the justice system itself. He urged authorities to reform how prison treat first-time offenders. He said when young men with minor crimes are locked up alongside hardened criminals, they don't get rehabilitated, they get corrupted. He spoke from experience. As a young offender, Kim had been placed among violent, repeat offenders. And it was there, he claimed, that he learned how to commit further crimes. In his words, prison had become a school, not for reform, but for destruction. His second point was more personal, more painful. Kim asked society to stop treating ex-convicts as if they were invisible. "I hope the coldness toward people like me will change," he wrote. He wasn't just speaking about himself, he was speaking for the many others like him who stepped out of prison only to find every door closed. No job, no support, no second chance. He believed that if someone, anyone, had shown him kindness, if the world had left a window open instead of slamming every door shut, maybe his rage wouldn't have grown. Maybe he wouldn't have become the man he did. These were not excuses. Kim never denied what he had done. But his words struck a nerve, because behind the headlines, behind the monstrous acts, there had once been a boy with potential. And somehow that boy was lost, not just to poverty or crime, but to isolation and rejection. The prison pastor who had spent time with Kim later recalled that on his final night, Kim wept during prayer. "I deeply regret the sins I committed," he said, asking for forgiveness from God and perhaps silently from the families he had broken. Whether those tears were sincere, no one will ever truly know. Was it fear of death? Was it a glimpse of genuine remorse? Or both? But for a brief moment before then, Kim Dae-doo didn't speak like a killer. He spoke like someone who finally understood the weight of what he had done. Kim Dae-doo left this world not with violence, but with regret. And in doing so, he forced an entire nation to look inward, to ask how monsters are made, and whether the silence of society can sometimes help shape them. His crimes were his alone, but the lessons, those belong to all of us. Aftermath. Shock waves through a nation. Kim Dae-doo's hanging brought an end to his life, but not to his story. The shock of his crimes didn't fade with the headlines. Instead, it sent deep ripples across South Korea, through neighborhoods, through institutions, and through the way a country saw itself. Before 1975, most Koreans had never ever heard the term serial killer. It was something that happened in distant places, whispered about in American newspapers or foreign crime novels. But suddenly, the monster wasn't overseas. He had walked among them. He had slipped through alleys and country roads, knocking on doors that were once left unlocked. And everything changed. In the weeks after Kim's arrest, people began locking their doors for the first time. Rural families bought new locks, nailed wooden bars across windows, and started checking in on each other after dark. In some towns, parents began to take turns patrolling at night, forming neighborhood watches from scratch. Not out of paranoia, but out of raw, learned fear. The media didn't let it go either. The case was dissected endlessly in newspapers and magazines. Illustrated crime journals printed sensationalized artwork of Kim's crimes, sometimes bordering on horror fiction. His name became a dark fixture in Korean folklore. Children were told, "Be good or Kim Dae-doo will come for you." It wasn't just a scare tactic, it was a cultural trauma being passed down in the only way people knew how to process it, as myth, as warning. But beneath the headlines and rumors, serious reflection had begun. Police departments were embarrassed by how long it had taken to stop Kim. He had crossed provinces, slipped between cities, and evaded capture by exploiting a system that didn't communicate across its own branches. In the years after the case, efforts were made to improve coordination between regional police forces. Detectives started to share case details more freely, especially when vulnerable victims were involved. While South Korea didn't immediately launch major reforms, his story was often cited in later years by social workers and psychologists. They warned that prison, isolation, and rejection could break people, and sometimes to wisdom beyond repair. Slowly, the country began to invest in rehabilitation programs, job training for ex-prisoners, counseling, reintegration, support. Progress was slow and uneven, but it was something. Because if Kim Dae-doo's life taught anything, it was this. You don't stop future monsters by locking them up. You stop them by recognizing them before they form. As one journalist will later write, we must make sure there will never be another Kim Dae-doo. Not just by catching such people earlier, but by never letting them fall so far in the first place. Culturally, his story was just the beginning. In the years that followed, South Korea would face more horrifying names. Jeong Do-young in the 80s, Yo Yong-chul in the 2000s, and many others. But Kim Dae-doo was the first, the one who shattered the illusion that this couldn't happen here. His story forced a reckoning with a new kind of evil. Books were written, films were inspired, academic studies referenced his case. Even decades later, traces of his shadow still could be found in Korean crime media. The fact that people still talk about him is proof of the scar he left behind. Kim Dae-doo didn't just take lives, he shattered a nation's sense of safety. His crimes live on as a painful reminder of what can grow in silence, in rejection, in the places we choose not to look. His victims deserve to be remembered, and his story should never be repeated. Conclusion. In the end, the story of Kim Dae-doo is more than just a tale of a serial killer. It's a haunting reminder of what can happen when anger, rejection, and despair are left to grow in silence. Here was a man who felt small, powerless, forgotten, and in his twisted search for meaning, he chose fear over healing, violence over redemption. He became the very thing he believed the world saw in him, a monster. And by doing so, he took 17 innocent lives and left scars on countless more. There is no justification for what he did. There never will be. But as we look back on this dark chapter in Korean history, we are left with hard questions. Not about him, but about us. How do we treat those who stumble, those who fall through the cracks? Could a kinder soul, a helping hand, or a second chance have made a difference before things went too far? Even Kim, in his final written words, pleaded with society to be less cold, not for his sake, but for those who might come after him. It was a disturbing message, but also a challenge, one we still haven't fully answered. For viewers, the lessons here are layered. Yes, this is a cautionary tale about personal responsibility. Kim Dae-doo made his choices, and he paid the ultimate price for them. But it also is a lesson in social responsibility, because environments shape people, and if we ignore those who are lost, bitter, or broken, we risk creating something far worse. As someone who's told many true crime stories and spoken to many murderers, killers, and psychopaths, I can tell you this: very few of them offer satisfying answers. Most leave behind a trail of pain, unresolved questions, and sometimes warnings, if we're willing to listen. Kim Dae-doo's crimes shook South Korea to its core, but from that terror came change. A more watchful and vigilant public, a police force that learned to look harder and act faster, and a nation that began asking deeper questions about justice and prevention. 17 people lost their lives, and for what? A man crushed by failure, a society that looked away, and a tragedy no one saw coming. Kim Dae-doo's story forces us to ask difficult questions about justice, about empathy, about what happens when someone falls through every crack. And sadly, this wasn't the last time in Korean history. If you believe these stories matter, if you want to understand not just what happened, but why, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel. There are more stories we need to tell.